Hello, my name is Jim Fletcher, and I'm here today to present to you my final project for EDT 8210, Applied Psychological Learning Theory in Digital Learning, and this is for the Instructional Design and Digital Learning program at Wright State University. So presented in this video is going to be a culmination of everything that we've learned in this semester. Cognitive load theory, cognitive theory of multimedia learning, the principles of instructional design, and how we use them in a presentation. And then the last thing will be refutation in the fire service. So starting off with cognitive load theory. Cognitive load theory just simply states that in order for us to facilitate learning, we as instructional designers should design presentations that take the architecture of the brain, of short-term memory, and use that to help facilitate learning. So now, cognitive theory has it's not really an assumption, I would call it, but cognitive theory, learning theory, only applies to new information, and in order to get the students to learn this information, you have to give precise and deliberate instructions as to how this fits into their everyday life, and that allows them to build the schemas, which we'll go over in a minute, to help recall that information. Now, for assumptions. The first assumption is that short-term memory can only process about 7 elements at one time. And theorists say it's plus or minus 2 for those. They also, within this first assumption, is you can only process 2 to 4 of those 7 elements, and that's only going to stay in your short-term memory or working memory for 20 seconds if it's not reinforced with other learning. The next assumption is schema, and schema refers to the files of the brain. Think of it as a great big library with all the books, and that is where everything is stored in long-term memory. And the last assumption is long-term memory, of course. Long-term memory is limitless. It has no limits. It's like the ocean in this picture. It just goes on for miles and miles. Whereas short-term memory or working memory is like the glass of water. You can only fill it up so far, and then it runs over and it can't hold any more information. So there are 3 types of cognitive load that go along with cognitive load theory. The first is intrinsic, and it is just a natural complexity of the material. Instructional designers have no authority over this. You can't change it. The next load is extrinsic load, and this is something that we can reduce in instructional design. It is solely based on how we present that material, whether the students, we make it more complex or we make it easier for the students to learn. And then the last one is germane load, and it has to do with the amount of brain resources that the students have to use in order to learn that information. So my next theory I'm going to talk to you about is the cognitive theory of multimedia learning. And what it says is that students learn more deeply when whatever you're presenting is presented with pictures and text. Not only do they hear it, but they see a representation of it as well, and this helps form that schema and form that mental models that the students need. Now there are some limitations that go with this too, and one of them is that this is a dual channel system. So you have the visuals, which is your eyes, and your audio, which is your ears, that work as 2 separate channels to form those mental models and those mental pictures, so that you help the students learn. Number 2, you have active learning. The students have to be able to have active learning And what active learning does is the selecting, the organizing, and then the integrating of this information that you're giving the students. So not only are they organized, selecting what they want to learn or want to hear, selecting or organizing it into the working memory, and then integrating it into long-term memory as what's happened in their lifetime. So the last one is limited capacity, and it just simply states that the dual channels that you have a limited capacity to retain the information that they're seeing and they're hearing. And then one key difference, and there's a couple key differences, but the one key difference is sensory memory. Everything that you see or hear passes through your sensory memory into the working memory. Now this is one difference from cognitive load theory because it's not mentioned in cognitive load theory. And then the last difference is the terminology. And as you can see from this slide, it's pretty much the same, and even in class I would get them mixed up, but you have to remember everything that is load is for cognitive load theory, everything that's a process is for cognitive theory of multimedia learning. So that was a quick overview of the cognitive load theory and cognitive theory of multimedia learning. So now what I want to get into is instructional principles. And what instructional principles are is just a way for instructional designers to help alleviate that extrinsic load while maximizing the intrinsic load for students as they go through a presentation. The first instructional principle I want to talk about is signaling. And you may often hear it referred to as cueing, but what it is it just highlights the relevant information that students want or need to understand. By highlighting that relevant information, it kind of reduces the extraneous load that students have to decipher from a passage or whatever you're studying. You highlight the relative portions, it takes the extraneous load out because they don't have to go through and figure out what's going on, what they need to remember, what they need to write down, and things like that. Now also for signaling principle, the one important thing is it can also be used to show relationships. So in the example that I have right here, it shows that, you know, the school books and everything is related to school. So you can do relationships also with signaling. So redundancy principle is the next principle I'd like to talk to you about. And what it says is don't use text, narration, and animation on the same presentation or on the same slide. It reduces the cognitive overload that students have because what they tend to do is they tend to focus on the text and not listen to the information, or they tend to focus on the narrative and not look at the text. So if you're trying to do both, it could cause overload. Now, redundancy just really means just don't use the same information over and over again. You need to either use the text and the animation on itself or the narration and the animation on itself. So for my last principle, I want to talk to you about temporal contiguity principle. And what it is if you're going to do a picture of, say, the heart, and you're going to have the students learn all of the areas of the heart, you don't want to have an A and then an A on the picture so that the student has to look at the words and then look at the picture to be able to get a visual. What temporal contiguity does is if you put just the picture of the heart with the words across it on each area, then the student doesn't have to hold that image of A, trying to find A in their working memory for very long, and they can actually learn better if they can just look at that picture and all the labels on that picture of the heart are there. So now that I've given you just 3 principles of instructional design, what I'd like to do is use them in a presentation. So what I'm going to be doing is doing a basic EKG reading class. And this is for the layperson who, goes to the doctor and sees that they have tracing of their heart, but they really don't know what it means. So what the EKG is an electrocardiogram, and what it does is it looks at the electrical activity of the heart. From that electrical activity, we can tell all kinds of things. So, this slide is a picture of a 12 lead that helps us look at different views of the heart, front, back, side, to see where the electrical activity is, how it's transversing through the heart, and if there's a problem. So the first beat of the heartbeat, the first wave, is a P wave. And what it signifies is the upper chambers of the heart, which are the atrials, firing. The next wave is actually a set of 3 waves, and what we call it is a QRS complex, and that is the ventricles firing, and that is the workhorse of your heart. The ventricles are where the blood is thrown. Specifically, the left ventricle is what pushes blood throughout the body. So in the QRS, you have the Q wave, which is the start of the wave. The R is the big upward deflection, and then the S is a downward reflection, and it may go down below the isoelectric line, which is this red line that I put across here. That is an imaginary line, but sometimes it won't. And then the very last wave of the heartbeat is the T wave. And what the T wave signifies is it signifies that your ventricles are ready to fire again. They're ready to go, they're primed, and they're going. So for this last part, I want to talk a little bit about refutation. And what refutation is taking something and making your students see that what they have been taught or believe is wrong, and that you need to try and get them to accept the new things. Now, part of this assignment was that we had to relate this to our profession. And since I am a firefighter, refutation is hard to find in the fire service because of, I want to say, change. And as you can see, my slide even says change is part of refutation. The fire service is big on, we've done it this way for 150 years, why change? It works, we're not going to do it. The best thing I can say is that in order for us to teach refutation in the fire service, we're going to have to make our firefighters, especially our older firefighters, understand that, in the last 50 years, a lot of things have changed. Just like flashover. Flashover now occurs within 3 minutes, whereas, when I started in the fire service in the 80s, it was still, 17 minutes or beyond because of the difference in the materials. Nowadays we have to worry about cancer from some of the smokes that we're in, where, back in the early, 60s and 70s, everything was hardwood. There wasn't a lot of hydrocarbons used or synthetic materials used. And when you were breathing smoke, you were truly breathing wood smoke. So refutation, I'm not sure whether I'm getting this part of this assignment correct, but in order for us to do refutation in the fire service, we're going to have to show our firefighters that how you've been taught things has changed, and in order for us to be safer and to go home every day after shift, we got to start changing the way we do things.